Hello everybody, and before we get to your questions today, I feel like I need to address some of the complaints about the last video, the last fan Q&A video that came out, I don't know, a month ago, whenever it was. Time is all just a blur these days. But basically, when I was shooting that, much like now, I believed, that you were only going to see me from like the rib cage up. But when I shot it, I was completely nude from the waist down. That's a practice that kids these days call shirt cocking, which was not, it was supposed to be part of the video, but what happened was, as some of you know, as came up in the comments, at one point I stood up to grab something in the middle of the video, and my groin area came into view. I saw that when I was editing and left it in because I just didn't think it was a big deal. I'm not ashamed of my body. We're all adults here. But I guess on YouTube, when you upload, if you don't set like a custom thumbnail, it just grabs a random frame from the video. And unfortunately, it grabbed that exact frame where my crotch came into view. I noticed it when I did the upload, but I thought again that it was fine because that the groin area was kind of blurred in the thumbnail, not for censorship reasons. It was motion blur, because I have a lot of long-time fans know that I have a medical condition that causes my genitals to vibrate. It's one reason why I have so much trouble getting through a security line at an airport. But I guess what happened, as some of you have said, and I completely understand that the complaint, was that on YouTube, if it detects that you've watched a shirt cocking video for 2 hours, in your recommendation, you just get an endless stream of other shirt cocking videos from the shirt cocking community and all the shirt cocking channels out there. So I know that has basically polluted your feeds now. If you go watch the video now, if you go look at it now, you'll see I've changed the thumbnail. I've edited out that part where I was standing up. It does make the video 40 minutes shorter, but I apologize for any inconvenience that may have caused you. I will not stand up while I'm shooting this one. So hopefully that satisfies you, and I do apologize. So again, this is the second fan Q&A video. I have your questions here printed out, and I'm going to jump right into them because I know your time is precious. And you probably took time off of work so you could watch this instead of doing that. So right off the bat, the obvious question, the one that I get the most often, two people that sent it in, New Jersey Nick and Dustin, both basically asking when the next book will be out. That is easy to answer because I am on a schedule and a deadline that is dictated by contract. The next John Dies at the End book will be out in fall of 2022. The next book, as has been previously mentioned, that I have out, period, is coming out just in a few short months, in October 13th, I believe. That is the next book in the other series, the science fiction series. Title of that one is Zoey Punches the Future and the Dick. That is book 2 in that series. You do not need to have read book 1 to understand that book. It's more like a Sherlock Holmes situation where there's it's same characters, but there's a new set of circumstances each time. And then the next John Dies at the End book will be out 2 years after that. That is the schedule I'm on. It takes me 2 years to write a book, so math dictates that you get a new book every 2 years. Some authors write them much faster than that. I don't know how. I recently quit my day job, so you would think I would be able to write books much faster. So far in 2020, that has not been the case. And it turns out, which I guess I already knew this on some level, that writing, the actual time you spend sitting at the keyboard kind of doesn't matter, because how long it takes you to write a story depends on the speed at which ideas occur to you. And it turns out when I don't have a day job, they don't occur to me any faster than they did before. So that's a good tip for writers out there. Whether you're spending your day at a day job or playing Animal Crossing and being sad about the pandemic, it doesn't matter. This stuff, the ideas occur at the same interval. And when I say ideas, I mean like you will write a part, you know, and it's like, okay, here's a scene. I finished the scene and it ended with the earth being destroyed, but the next scene takes place on earth, and I know that. So now I have to figure out, well, how's that going to work? So a lot of the time spent writing is just spent wandering around aimlessly waiting for that solution to pop into your brain, because the part of your brain that does that stuff is a separate subconscious thing that kind of just operates on its own. This is why so many authors just drink themselves to death, I think. It can be something of a lonely job, because it's kind of, it's not like writing a sitcom where you got a writer's room and you could just, you know, solicit ideas from the other writers. It's just you. Next, endless stream of questions about the movie or TV show or anything else like that. The Jonesy Jones asked if John Dies at the End was going to get some sort of a series, live action puppets, animated. Jake asked if I'd been approached for another movie deal or series. Carl asked same thing. Neil, Nathan, Brian, Joel. Lots of people asked this question. From your point of view, there's no news, because the only news that's relevant to you as a fan would be, yes, they're shooting it and it's going to be out next year or whatever. And I don't have that news at all. Now, from my end, there's always news, but the news is, hey, we've got a meeting with these people to talk about a series, or hey, they've brought a writer on board to this project. But you have to understand that none of that really means anything. And I've known this for a long time, but Hollywood is kind of an endless string of meetings and conference calls about what show is going to get made next. And I am extremely fortunate. I have two series that I've written, the John Dies at the End series and the Zoe Ash series. And both of them I have sold the film and TV rights for. In both cases, the film and TV rights are held by people who are actively trying to make shows out of them. They're not just sitting in the bottom of a pile somewhere. I've been on calls and meetings with people in Hollywood you may have heard of. I don't mean like Tom Cruise, but the producers, things like that, that are actual people that can get shows made. But everything is still at a stage where most things don't become a show, even though they've made it to that point. So I've gotten much, much further than most authors. I'm incredibly fortunate. But from your point of view, until someone actually closes the deal and says yes, and that could happen. I could get a text message right now, 5 minutes from now, saying, hey, we've got a deal that they're going to do a John Dies at the End series that's going to air exclusively on TikTok, and it's going to star Logan Paul as David and Jake Paul as John, and Amy will be an entirely CGI creation voiced by Norm Macdonald. And it's going to be great. It's going to air in 15-second increments on TikTok. But until then, it's just one of an endless pile of properties that are just kind of all in progress. Because the reality is, if you go to a bookstore, the next time the law allows you to go to a bookstore, if there are any left, you look around at the thousands of books on the shelves. Well, every single one of those books, I can guarantee you, someone in Hollywood has had a meeting about turning that thing into a movie or a TV show. And then you think about all of the TV show pitches that are just, hey, let's make this show again. Or for every movie that did decently that could potentially be a TV series, I can guarantee you someone has pitched it as a miniseries. You know, every cool show, it's like they're making a John Wick TV series, you may have heard. So you're competing with, you know, every video game, every comic book, every old show, everything, every intellectual property that's ever been made. Someone out there is having conference calls about throwing around the idea of making it into a show or making it into a movie. For every movie that's been made, there's conversations about getting a sequel made. There's somebody trying to get funding together. And my projects are kind of all in various stages of that. So I don't want to come off as discouraging, because the truth is you just don't know. And I've been so fortunate to already have a movie that successfully got made, has made my career. That's amazing. But in terms of, I've had messages about a John Dynasty board game, but it doesn't exist, because the reality is it doesn't cost them anything to listen to your idea. It doesn't cost them anything to get you on the phone and let you pitch your thing. And most projects just don't ultimately go anywhere. I personally would guess that at some point in my lifetime, another thing will get made. I have been very encouraged about the news about the Zoey TV show, but at the same time, I'm out of the loop on that. I could hear any minute now that something has happened. Or I could eventually just hear that, hey, the rights have lapsed and they're yours again. They couldn't make it work. Who knows? Next, actually multiple people, Dev and Justin were two of them, that asked about adapting John Dynasty into a comic book. That's, again, something that's come up. But again, it's not simple. It's not as simple as me saying, because obviously I can't draw and I don't know anything about comics as a format. So it's not as simple as me saying, hey, let's make it a comic book. You've got to have artists on board and people that can actually produce a comic. You've got to be able to work with them. You've got to figure out the money if there's a comic publisher that wants it. There's rights issues if they're using like the depictions of the characters as they appear in the movie. I think that gets into the film rights rather than the book rights. There's a lot of stuff to work through, and from my point of view, it would be the equivalent, I think, of, even though the book's already written, of taking on a job that is basically doing that instead of writing the next book, because I would have to be involved. But the involvement wouldn't be minor, because comics are a completely different format. Like everything about the rhythm of the storytelling, about how much of the story you can fit in there, and determining the art style. There's just a million creative decisions that would have to be made. So it's one of many, many things where it would be super cool to have it exist, but my time and energy is limited. And as I mentioned, it just getting the next book written is turning out to be a challenge, or it's all that I can handle. It's not a challenge in the sense that it's not going to get written. It's just that piling on more things would be tough. Patrick and Rich both asked questions about what I would change if I had a shot at writing the first movie again, or if I could have written my own treatment for a movie, that kind of thing. That's always a little bit of a weird, it's almost a catch-22 of a question. Because the reality is, if I sat down with a computer and just typed up my own screenplay for like the ideal movie, yeah, I could do it, but what I came up with would cost $200 million to shoot. So if you're talking about, if you want something that it can actually be shot, and you have to be talking about that if you're writing a screenplay. That's the thing. You can't just say, well, what scenes would you have left in, or what would you have changed? That's so unfair, because I can write on the page, and then Dave jumps out onto the wing of the airliner and fights the bad guy. But if you're trying to shoot that movie and you've got a set budget, and you're having to actually think, okay, what can we do that would make that work and look good? And you realize, oh, the answer is no, we couldn't. To get the budget to do that, you would have to take out all of the stuff you like about it. So the point being that if I had to work within the limitations of, of what's a reasonable, what could be shot and what could be shot on budget, that's a completely different answer. And I can't answer it because I don't know anything about shooting movies. One example I always like to bring up, if you watched Game of Thrones, the TV show on HBO about dragons, I don't know if you saw it. One thing that fans would ask is, well, why were the dire wolves, why did they kind of disappear from the show? Because the dire wolves in the book are like of huge importance. They're key characters, and there's like a prophecy tied to the dire wolves and the 5 wolves and the 5 children that have the wolves and all that. And the TV show, they just kept finding the excuses to not have the wolves there. They would just unceremoniously kill them off screen, or have them just wander off and leave, or just wave to them off screen. Well, the reason is because they found out that they're almost impossible to shoot. There's issues with transporting the wolves, I guess, transporting the trained wolves to Ireland where they shoot the show. So they would have to go to Canada where the wolves are located and shoot that footage. And then the stuff they shot in Ireland would have to be made to match. And they would have to like rotoscope in the wolf and try to get the performances to match. And apparently it's so expensive and so difficult that the only way to include them would be to like cut out the dragons or a bunch of other things that are also crucial to the story. And it's something where if you're sitting at home, if you watch something that's that huge of a budget, and Game of Thrones is like $30 million an episode or something like that, you would assume that anything you want made, like the filmmaker's imagination just appears on the screen, that anything you want done, you can get done because, well, there's CGI and but even in a show like that where they had basically an unlimited budget, they still had to make a creative decision based on this very arbitrary limitation that for some reason countries don't like it when you transport giant wolves into the country, or maybe the wolves themselves don't hold up to travel, whatever the reason was. But it's this real world obstacle that because they were not in the story and because they're so difficult to shoot, they had to completely change some story elements. Because in the books, it's very obvious the wolves are a big, crucial deal, and that some of the characters can like teleport their souls into the wolves, and it's like a key part of the universe. And in the show, they became a total non-factor by the end, all because of these logistical issues. Well, on a small budget, niche, weird horror movie, it's that times 1,000, to the point where basically you're going scene by scene, and everything you want to include is going to be based on, well, what do we have available? Who do we have available? What can we make look good? Like, because you can be ambitious, but wind up with something that doesn't seem real or whatever. So that's the thing. And that's why I never give like a straight answer on that, because it's just unfair. Similarly, Posh asks, are there any lines, parts that got cut out of the original permuted press edition of John Dies the End that you regret being cut? For those of you who don't know, the book that is on the shelf now, the John Dies the End novel, it went through several iterations. It was originally published on the internet, one chapter at a time as a serial, and then was kind of edited on the fly. I would add things and then go back and insert setup, because on the internet you can do that. You can just type stuff and change it, and what are people going to do about it? Nothing. I was giving it to them for free, so what can they complain that I was like literally rewriting, retconning the canon as I went? And then I did a self-published edition through Cafe Press, and I did a re-edit of the novel to make it into one coherent thing. And then when it went to the small but very cool print-on-demand publisher, Permuted Press, who is the reason you've read the book, is those guys got the thing into print and got it into bookstores first. We did another edit, but they didn't make any demands at all. They just gave me a chance to polish it again, and then it went through a copy edit. But there was, at that stage, there was nothing that they made me cut. Now, here's the thing. The line that this person asked me about cutting, I didn't know was not still in the book. And that's actually why I included this question, because this is something I think most people don't realize. There are scenes that I wrote that it took me 6 months to think up and put together, and then they were in every edition of the story. And at the very last minute, I cut them, maybe because of pacing reasons, maybe because it was the wrong tone for the scene. Maybe it was just like, no, this is going on too long and the reader's really eager to get back to what Amy is doing, so we're going to cut this short. But just because that was cut from the final novel doesn't mean that scene does not still exist in my brain, right? Because I lived with it for months and months and months as part of the story. So the stuff that got cut from the earlier editions and the stuff that's still in there now, if you quizzed me on what's in the edition now versus what got cut, I probably would fail, because the creation of that scene or that conversation or whatever was a very big event to me. It took a lot of my energy, but the effort to cut it was not. That was a decision that was made in a few seconds. So the fact that it doesn't exist in the final book, and that, you know, I can read it and it's like, yeah, I'm satisfied with the rhythm of it. But if you came back and asked me, well, would you want that back in there? Half the time when you add whatever you pointed out, I would be surprised that it's not in there, because it all exists in my brain, including stuff that's like entire characters that didn't make it in the story, because I can't erase it from my brain just because, you know, okay, well, this is the final book. And I think people that shoot movies, it's kind of the same way, that that a director would be like maybe surprised that a shot or a scene got cut because they remember shooting it, and then the decision from the editor or for whoever to go ahead and cut it for pacing reasons or whatever, they may have, you know, that may have not been a major emotional decision at all. It may have been just something that was done as one of the final steps. And they may not realize until they sit down at the premiere, like, whatever happened to that shot we did of the guy falling off the building? It's like, oh yeah, we cut that. And I guess all of that is to say, I maybe don't have the same emotional attachment to things that didn't make it in, because I still have them. They're still in my brain. I didn't lose access to that line or whatever that you liked. All I know is that when I do the edits, the editing, at least the way I write, editing is most of the process. I write a very sloppy draft with everything in there, and then most of it is writing, rewriting, and polishing. So whatever changes I made, I didn't make them lightly. Like because I put a lot of work into writing a thing or coming up with something I thought was really funny or good. To throw it out is not something I would just do. So I am very comfortable with. I can't think of like an edit that I regret making. But mostly because I tend to just move on to the next thing. It's like once it exists and it's in the world in print, then it belongs to the world now. It's not. I'm not going to do a George Lucas thing and go back and try to fix an old book or whatever. Vicky asks, when first pitching John Dies at the End, did you find you had to break through any barriers in the writing industry when it comes to expected genre, style, and audience? I never had to pitch it. Longtime fans know this already, but my process was I wrote this on the internet as a series of blog posts. I had never written for money in my life. I had no agent, no publisher, no English degree, no nothing. I was just a guy. I'm still just a guy, strangely. That I had wrote this for free, and then did a cafe press edition, which back in that day you could just take the same thing you do on Amazon now. You can take a PDF and upload it, and then people can buy it for some outrageous amount of money. And sold a few hundred of those. And then from there, this other Permuted Press came along and said, hey, we can do a much nicer looking edition that's got an actual, the barcode and the number that people can look up. It'll be on Amazon. It'll get in many more people's hands. But again, I still didn't have an agent at the time. And the editor I was working with, we weren't working through the story. It was just formatting stuff. It was taking this thing, the Cafe Press edition, and putting it into their format with a new cover and new artwork and all that stuff. But there was nothing like what you think of as having to pitch the book or approach, agents or anything like that. There's no cover letter. I've never been through that process. If you ever ask me for advice on like, well, how do you find an agent or how do you get through to a publisher? I'm the worst person to ask. I took a very unconventional route. Because in what happened there is the Permuted Press edition fell into the hands of a famous horror director, producer, Don Coscarelli, who contacted me about buying the film rights. And from then I had to go rapidly find an agent. And then from there, one of the biggest book publishers in the world, Macmillan, and it was their imprint, it was Thomas Dunn Books at the time. They came along, heard about the movie deal, and then picked up the rights to the series from this other publisher. But there, like me finding an agent was like the publisher saying, yeah, we know a guy who's really good. We work with him a lot. But that was because I needed somebody to look at the contract. It wasn't, it wasn't a thing where the normal process where, authors are trying to find an agent and then from there trying to, get a book pitched. I did it all backward. And then the movie came out. The second book in the series made the New York Times bestseller list, and from then on, that was it. It was off to the races. I've been extremely, extremely fortunate. My example is not typical. Jake asks, I've noticed most of the big bads and creepy crawlies from the John and Dave series have an underlying theme of deception. I was wondering if this is intentional, and if so, what was the inspiration behind it? And by this he means these are a lot of creatures that can disguise themselves as other things, other people, and there's a lot of themes going into the ways that they hide themselves and what it means and the nature of their deception and that kind of thing. The answer to this one is really simple and probably disappointing. But if you're doing horror that takes place in the everyday world where it's not a zombie apocalypse. It's not a future where vampires rule the earth. If it takes place in our world, in normal modern day where people are going out, shopping and going to eat at restaurants and living their normal lives, but there are monsters, well, those monsters have to be invisible somehow because otherwise they would have upended society. So if you have somebody doing a thing where they were continually going up against monsters or demons or something like that, all of those creatures, one element of what they do has to be that they are invisible to the world at large, that most of the world doesn't know about them because, it's the same with any haunted house story. They take place in a world where no one's going to believe you because, they don't think ghosts are real, but the ghosts are also invisible most of the time and they hide themselves. So that is kind of a mechanical limitation in the type of stories I'm telling. But then from that, I work really hard to make that kind of part of the story and part of what's scary about them, and thinking in terms of how they hide themselves and and the increasingly weird and elaborate ways that they deceive people. And that's something I find fascinating about nature, the way that the creatures camouflage themselves, or will the way that parasites can influence the brain in ways that creature's not aware of. It's all deception because it's a valuable survival skill, and you got to figure if monsters existed, they would have those same skills. Tom says, the shadow people in the John Dies DN series remind me a lot of the commonly recurring sleep paralysis demons that a lot of the world experiences. Is this something you've experienced personally, or is it a coincidence? It's actually a third choice. I've never experienced it personally, but I am aware of the phenomenon because it comes up in a lot of books and articles about sleep paralysis. It's one of the most common dreams that people have. It's one of the most common hallucinations that people have, of just some sort of a faceless shadow coming into the room or coming through the window, something like that. I have read articles that say there's actually brain science behind it, because there's a part of the brain, because humans are social creatures and a lot of our brain is built around how we relate to other humans, that there's a part of the brain that kind of intuits when there's another person in the room with you. Sometimes you may feel like you can detect when someone is staring at you from behind you. And in reality, there's nothing supernatural about it. It's just you picked up some noise or something, but your brain is built to sense when somebody is around. And allegedly, if that part of the brain misfires, it can sense a person where there's no person. And I guess in sleep paralysis, that's a really common, for whatever reason, that's a really common hallucination. And all it is it's your brain, it's like projecting a shape of a person, but because there's nobody there, the brain, you kind of interpret it as just like a shadow or a dark shape that you sense is shaped like a person. There's another experiment where they actually could use electrodes in the brain and force the hallucination, and force the sense that there is a shadow person like standing behind you, which it sounds terrifying, but it is just, ultimately, it's just a brain mechanism. Keep in mind, I don't believe in ghosts or demon possession, that kind of thing. I'm not that type of a person. I think it would actually be kind of weird to write these stories if I did believe in that kind of thing. 3 different people asked, Alyssa, Frank, and Aiden all asked some variation of questions about the difference in tone across the 3 John and Dave books. John dies at the end, This Book is Full of Spiders, and What the Hell Did I Just Read? And asked about, like, why was the second book so much darker and more violent? Or how did your approach change that they're so completely different in terms of emotional pathos? And here's the thing, I didn't know the tones were different until people told me that. I didn't do that on purpose. Especially in difference in because to me the first book seems extremely gruesome and violent and has an ending that to me is about as dark as an ending can be. But when the second book came out, which even to this day, I don't see what they mean in terms of being darker, but everyone says it. You're right. I have a minority opinion. I don't know if it's just that I got older, or if it's just my mood changed or something. I don't know, because I wasn't trying to do it on purpose. I wish I had a better answer for that, but that's one of the most surprising bits of feedback I've ever gotten is people just saying, well, why, like, these books are so different. It's like, they're not trying to be different. I mean, they were written, these 3 books were written over the course of 20 years. So I guess I'm not the same person I was when I was 25. So I don't know. I'll be interested if later in life, if I'll go back and read them, if when I've got more distance from it, if I'll say, man, what was going on when I wrote that second one? Why is it so depressing? But then Alyssa followed up with a second question. She mentioned that the first book is purely first person from David's point of view, and then it started introducing multiple perspectives, and then What the Hell Did I Just Read really depends heavily on bouncing across multiple perspectives, and where you've got, I actually don't know of another book that's written this way, where you've got one person reporting first person and then everyone else is third person, and it's kind of framed like they provided their account to David, and then they are there's varying degrees of reliability in what they reported. Like the events are very different from depending on who's telling the story. But she asked, that says that she always struggled writing first person point of view. Did I have any suggestions in writing that way? And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on writing tips because I know most of you are not writers and maybe you're not so interested in like the mechanics of writing a story. The hardest part about first person point of view is, and you'll even see like great authors struggle with this, is that you have to stick with that person in every scene. And so everything has to happen in front of that person. Like every piece of information that you're relaying to the reader, your main character has to learn it firsthand. You can't just cut to what the bad guys are doing. I liked doing first person for horror because I feel like you can make it much, much scarier when the main character doesn't know what's going on, where their ignorance and the things that they weren't there to see, you can take advantage of that. You know, you can turn that weakness into a strength because their ignorance is part of what's scary. They don't know what's happening to them. And then, but it is a challenge because you have to really think through, well, how does he know this? How does he find out this thing? And it can wind up being very exposition heavy because your temptation is just have a series of characters come up to them and tell them what's happening. Or in the haunted house movies where they've always got like they'll eventually have the guy just come tell them the name of the demon, and they'll hire a demonologist and whatever. They just tell them that, like, that's all right. Yeah, it's like, here, it's in a book. So the only thing is that you can have in your book, okay, here's the point where the main character finds out this piece of information, and then you have to challenge yourself to find some creative way for them to learn that. Hopefully in a way that involves action, in a way where the discussion they're having with someone, there's something emotionally charged about the discussion, or it's funny, or it's something, but it's not just information being relayed to them. Because the information they learn kind of has to be secondary. The audience isn't necessarily going to realize I'm learning information here. It has to be conveyed through drama or conflict or something else that provides energy to that exchange. But otherwise, also that's very simplistic advice, but it would take a lot of hours to kind of dig into the fine art of how to do it. For me, it took a lot of practice and trial and error because it is difficult writing first person. But ultimately, I grew to really depend on it because I like being able to go just deeply inside the person's stream of thoughts. And in John Dies Den, like half of the jokes and observations are just David thinking things to himself in the middle of conversations. And his internal monologue kind of interrupts scenes and conversations and inserts things. And that would be awkward to do if it was third person. You're normally not that close to a person's thoughts when you're doing it third person, right? So I guess there's strengths and weaknesses there. But I do see why you can struggle doing it. It is difficult, and it's difficult to structure in terms of plot. Because you'll even have, I can't remember what book I was reading, but it was like a detective novel or whatever, and the detective has to be like walking past a room and happens to hear the bad guys discussing their plan at that exact moment. Because the writer's like, okay, he needs to find this out, but there's no one in the story to tell him. So the only thing they could think of was for him to be walking past the room by blind coincidence at the exact moment the conversation he needs to overhear is happening. But because it's first person, they couldn't think of how else to do it. And you'll see that a lot. It's in first person stories where they really struggled to think of, well, why are all of these things happening right in front of this character? We have a few questions that are about theme, And again, I guess I do have writing tip questions on here. You'll just have to bear with me if you're not interested in like pulling back the curtain on how stuff is written. But Zach, for instance, asked, when you start a piece of fiction, are you usually pursuing plot or are you pursuing theme or something else? There's two answers to that. One, and this is for all of you aspiring writers out there, a story can start from anywhere. A story can start with just an idea for a character, or it can start with just an idea for a tone. John Dies at the End started with a tone. Just this idea of this very rapid fire comedy, slapstick, gruesome horror. Like that's where it started. The plot, the exact characters, everything else like that came later. What started was just this voice and this way of talking, that it was going to be this style that was just basically internet comedy as it existed back then, where every sentence or every other sentence is a punchline. And it's just very fast and very funny and very dark. But in other cases, some people started books just with a character or with just the voice of a narrator, and then we'll come up with what that narrator is doing later. Other people will decide, like he mentioned, you start with theme. Like many times somebody will sit down and say, I want to write a book about economic injustice in America, or I want to write a book about the futility of love or mortality or middle age or whatever. And they'll start with that subject, and then from there work around to, okay, well, who's the best character to tell the story through? What's the best tone for the narration to take? But in terms of any time someone starts to tell you like how to manufacture an idea for a story or where it's going to come from, it can start from anything. And if you read, any author talking about how they came up with an idea for a book, so often it's just like, well, I was on vacation in Venice and I saw a dead possum on the road, and then I thought, well, hey, what if that possum came to life and attacked people? And that's how I wrote my novel about zombie possums. They'll talk like it's just, I just saw something, on the side of the road and then decided it just sparked my imagination. Ultimately, what it comes down to is basically if you're doing this as a job, you're just always on the lookout for something. And to be honest, the starting point of the story is kind of the least important part, aside from, does it make you want to write it? I'm going to try to think of an example. Sometimes when I'm giving writing advice, when I reach for examples, I'll use like Star Wars or Robocop or Harry Potter. It's not, it gives the impression that, one, that I've never read a book before, or even worse, that I think you've never read a book before, and so that I think the only examples I can use as it's like, well, it's like in the Avengers when Captain America. I use those examples obviously because they're the ones that are most likely for all of you to be familiar with. They're not the best examples, but if I sit here and say, well, it's just like the 1904 crime novel 5 to Midnight that came out and 400 people read it. Then the advice doesn't mean anything because you don't know what I'm talking about. But there's more questions. Angelo asked, it says, seems most of your books have an overall coherent message behind them, like about mob mentality, that sort of thing. And is that message for each book intended from the start as you write? And he says, John Dies at the End, book 1 doesn't seem to have one. Is there one? I personally have to have a theme in mind when I'm writing, because the plot will hang on to the theme. And if you don't know, if you're totally new to all of this and you don't know what I mean by theme, let me use the example. Okay, we'll use Robocop. Robocop has a theme, right? It is uh, about a cop who becomes a robot, but it takes place in this city that's being taken over by a corporation. And it is a satire of the Reagan era and the greed era, and basically corporations taking over the country and taking over private services, that kind of thing. And so the police officer having his body mutilated and then replaced by a machine that is owned by a company, it's a metaphor that's not rocket science, you know. And so over the course of the movie, he has to rediscover his humanity, because when he first becomes Robocop, he can't remember his name. He can't remember his history. And over the course of the movie, he has to remember who he is and what he is. And then eventually he takes off like his helmet to reveal his entire face, his full human face now, his own eyes. And then finally realizes that he, instead of shooting these poor people on the street, he's got to go up into the tower where the CEO is and overcome his programming, get it, to rebel from the corporation. The corporation programmed him, almost the way media programs us. You see, it's a crude metaphor, but the reason I use that is that every plot point ties back into that theme. To where ultimately he shoots the guy, he falls out of the window, and the person says, "What's your name?" He says, "My name is Murphy." And that's the final line of the film. He has rediscovered his humanity, and then that is put in the context of this is the challenge we all have. We all have to hold on to our humanity in a world full of machines and corporations and systems that would rob you of your humanity if they could, to just turn you into a product or into a producer of goods. So there, when they're writing their fun cop turns into a robot movie, they had this other theme. And this is what's crucial, the theme dictates the plot at every turn. And so for me, I like to have that theme where it's like, okay, this book kind of is coming back, like say the second John Dice at the End book. This book is full of spiders. It's kind of constantly coming back to that theme of paranoia, mob mentality, the way fear moves through crowds, and the way people process fear, and the way people mistrust each other, and the difficulty of living in a large society when we have very simple monkey brains. When I'm trying to think of the next thing to happen in the story, if you know what your theme is, that helps to dictate to you what the next thing is to happen. And you can see that in any action movie, even, where it's like there's some, what was the Fast and Furious spinoff they made? I keep wanting to say Calvin and Hobbes. That was not what it was called. Hobbs and Shaw, I think, where it was The Rock and Jason Statham. Well, they've got some rough theme about family overcoming technology, because the bad guy's like a cyborg, but in order to beat him, they have to like reconnect with their roots or something. And so the final battle takes place back on the Rock's hometown, his home island. And they came up with that because that ties into the theme of the movie they came up with. Even though it's this goofy Fast and Furious spinoff, they still came up with a theme that they could hang everything on, because it just helps dictate to you what the plot will be. So if you're trying to think up a monster that works really well in that story about paranoia, well, it's got to be a monster that can perfectly imitate a person, and that, you know, and it takes advantage of people's paranoia or whatever, so that everything that happens ties back into that theme. So the challenges the heroes are facing are always tied back to this central thing. It's people being unable to trust them. It's the irrational actions people take, you know, based on fear. Whereas if you were just thinking of a novel as just a series of things that occur, that's where you get writer's block. Because it's like, okay, we just had a big action scene, so we need something here that's a little bit slower. Let's just have like a romantic scene or something. You're just throwing in stuff that it's like, well, it's been a while since we've had a funny bit, let's have a funny bit here. Whereas if you know what your theme is, you can keep coming back to, okay, now we know what this next conversation is going to be about. It's going to be about this subject and about this challenge, this ongoing thing, this part of this greater arc. He said it seemed like the first book did not have such a specific theme. It did. It's maybe not as clear cut, and maybe it's not spelled out as explicitly, but there it's a theme that you get in a lot of horror, where in a lot of movies that feature characters this age, and in this place in life, where you've got a couple of losers who have graduated high school, they're not in college, they don't have careers, they don't have long-term relationships, they're just adrift and kind of unmotivated and kind of just don't know what the world expects of them. So when you put them in possession of something like the soy sauce, which for those of you who are listening to this but for some reason have never read those books, it's this black substance that kind of gives them the ability to interact with demons and monsters and these demigods that kind of exist everywhere, and kind of detach them from time and space as we understand it to see the world beyond the world. Well, there, if you're looking for a symbol, it's these young people having the experience that you have had if you're that age or older, where the world just crashes in on you, where you realize how poorly prepared for the adult world you are. Whether you've been to college or now, after you graduate, after you've been kicked out of the house, and suddenly you see how the world really works, and you see how jobs really work and the job market really works, and the ways people take advantage of you and how adult relationships really work, it just crashes in on you like a ton of bricks. And so this was kind of a symbol for that, because it's that only on a much larger scale. They suddenly find themselves having all of this responsibility because they have abilities and knowledge that nobody else has, but the world has not prepared them for it. And it's sort of the same thing when you get out of high school and suddenly you're being asked to like do your taxes. It's like, why didn't I have a class on this? Why did I have a class in gym where we learned square dancing instead? Why did they not teach me this? Why did they not teach me how to read my cell phone bill? It's that, but it's a big, gruesome, hilarious version of that, where it's like, why didn't anybody tell me that this was the true nature of the universe? And you feel like the system's kind of failed you because you are so wholly unequipped to deal with it. And then between the three characters, and John Dave and then Amy showing up in the second half of the book, you see three distinct approaches to adulthood. And where John, because he doesn't know any better, wants to just plunge forward into adventure. It's all new and fresh. And it's like, yeah, this is the next cool thing. Let's go do it. And where Dave is so cynical and so burned out on the world and so disappointed by everything he sees, he would just prefer to go home and just go back to bed. Like, I don't care that there's a monster after me. Like, that doesn't interest me any more than the fact that I don't have a retirement plan. Like, I don't want to deal with it. And then with Amy, you see someone who is not adventurous like John, but you see someone who feels an obligation to fix the world. It's like embraces that, oh, this is what adulthood demands of me. And so that's all that was. Again, it's helpful in terms of thinking the next thing that's going to happen, because it's, John Dice in the end has such an off-the-rails plot where it is basically utterly impossible to predict from the first 100 pages what the last 100 pages is going to look like. It's not just twists. It's just the entire plot just flies off a cliff. But that plays into the theme, because the whole idea is they are never able to get a grasp on what's happening, why it's happening. They get conflicting stories. They run into all these people with different agendas, and everyone's lying. And it's like, yeah, that's what it's like to be an adult. That's what it's like to be naive in a world where you're suddenly in institutions that are thousands of years old and that know very well how to manipulate people like you and how to screw over people like you. And there are other people that know all the tricks and you don't. And it seems like black magic in a way. So all of it was just kind of a metaphor for that. It's not very groundbreaking. Any movie, you know, that any action movie that has supernatural elements with characters that age, you know, has some of that where it's like, okay, we have to accept the responsibility that comes with having the abilities that we have, and figure out what we're going to do with them. Um, Username Pimp Daddy Less Swag or Daddy. See, it doesn't. There's a letter missing in there. Says the soy sauce symbolizes free will, right? The John Diane series gets a lot out of looking at the horror of a deterministic universe, and it feels like the sauce's real power is being able to meaningfully mess with that determinism by jumping around time and so on. And yeah, of course, it's I'm not saying, of course, like that's very perceptive that you picked up on that. But I'm saying, of course, because of it ties into what I just said, and that it's them suddenly having the ability to break the restraints that have been put onto them, and you get into a lot about free will, about what you're actually able to do, what the universe actually allows you to do, but they have this substance that lets them break free of that, but they're not at the wheel at all. It'd be like if you were driving in a car and suddenly it took off into outer space. Like, that would be cool, but it would also be terrifying because your steering wheel now doesn't do what you think it does. You're not turning left and right. You don't know where you're going. You don't know how to navigate the stars. And it's kind of like that. It's like, yeah, that's great. We're in space. My car is magic, but so what? Have I just found a more spectacular way to die? Because I'm not an astronaut. I'm not a pilot. I'm just in a car that is now in space. So, yeah. And not to rehash what I just said, but you can see the symbolism there and why that ties into, for example, there's a reason these characters are this age and at this position in life. There's a reason this story doesn't happen to two middle-aged cops, or it doesn't happen to a scientist who discovered the sauce in the lab. It had to happen to these two guys at that age from a depressed part of the country where they basically have been left behind by a system and an economy that basically they don't know how to navigate. And so this is just taking their existing anxieties and multiplying them times 1,000. Good horror should do that. You know, The Shining takes the anxiety of a bad marriage and just ramps it up and up and up. But the anxiety was already there. The fact that there's this tension in the relationship and then suddenly they're isolated from the world, even if no ghost had shown up, The Shining would still be a horror story. Because you just have this man who's an alcoholic, suddenly cut off from alcohol, isolated from the world, and all of the tensions of this marriage just start boiling over the months and months, or the weeks and months that they can't get away. And it's just them. There's no one else to talk to. Just that alone would have made it scary. And you add in the ghost and the paranoia and his increasingly erratic behavior, and it just takes that existing tension and ramps it, you know, up more and more. That's good horror should do that. Ananias says, I know that your books can be read independently from one another, but have you considered writing a continuity-heavy book series? I put this on here for promotional purposes. I'm guessing very few people watching this have read all 4 of my books, or you've read some of them, or maybe just one of them. Any of these, you can be picked up in any order and you can read. It's like a Sherlock Holmes situation. They start the same characters, but it's a new case each time. Each book is a complete story, beginning, middle, and end. It ends in a satisfying way. No book ends on a cliffhanger. There's no dangling plot threads where you're like, you have to buy the new book to find out how it ends. I don't write that way. These are any book you can pick up. You can pick up book 3 of John Dies the End, and it will make just as much sense to you, or just as little sense to you, as if you had read the first 2. The things in that book that are confusing, I assure you that reading the previous 2 books will not clear it up at all. If anything, it will make it worse. So they asked, have I ever considered writing a continuous series like, the Game of Thrones books or whatever that's one continuous story? I actually don't know how to do that. I actually don't know how other authors do that. Because when I'm writing a book, I don't write straight through page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm continually circling back because that's just how writing in the word processor era works. I've never had to write, like with a typewriter where you're kind of forced to just, you complete this page and go on to the next. It's always been this thing where you circle back and circle back. And if you don't know what I mean by circle back, I mean, you're writing a scene and it's like, okay, I don't know how to get these characters out of this situation. They're trapped in a burning car and they've got to get out somehow. And so when you're writing it, you think, well, gosh, it could work if like John had a gun in his boot. Well, that's just, you just got to scroll up to earlier in the story and write a scene where he puts a gun in his boot. And then you do it in a way so you're disguising it, so that it's not clear that you're setting up something that's going to pay off later. You make a joke out of it that he carries this gun in his boot, so I make fun of him for having a gun in his boot. And then later on, he pulls it out. Well, I wrote the payoff first and the setup later. Well, if you're writing book 5 and the first 4 books already exist, so if you're George R.R. Martin and you're like, man, I cannot think of how to get Jon Snow from the Wall to King's Landing in time for this thing to happen, I sure wish I had previously set up some fast travel thing that he can now use, that it wouldn't just seem like a cop-out. The way I write, I can do that. I can adjust. If I see at the end, like, look, I need all of the characters to be in this spot for this finale to work, but there's no plausible way for them to get there. I can go back and adjust the previous parts of the story to make it so it's okay. But I can't do that if those previous books are already published and have sold 20 million copies and became the subject of a hit TV show. You're kind of locked in. You can't just have, oh yeah, I forgot to mention, Tyrion can fly. I meant to mention that in book 2, so please just go with it. I think that's one reason why he has not finished that series. I feel like in most ongoing series that I read, you can find a part where they wrote themselves into the corner a little bit. Even the great authors, even Tolkien, I'm sure that the third Lord of the Rings book has stuff that they kind of raise, like, well, how will they win this battle? Maybe a bunch of ghosts will come fight for them. And wishes that he could have gone back and set that up better, or maybe not. So answer your question, I think it would be really cool. It would be cool to have like everyone hanging on, waiting to see the next book and how it turns out. I don't even know how to start that, because I would be so scared of sending that first one out without having the subsequent ones written, and you don't have them written in advance. You're doing it as you go. That I don't know. I would be scared to death that I had accidentally sent a book out that had boxed me in later. Other David asks, do you feel some obligation to fans of John Didion in regards to moving the story forward? For example, if inspiration told you to kill off Amy, do you think the fear of backlash would keep you from writing it? No, it would not keep me from writing it. Knowledge that the fans of their emotional reaction would encourage me to write it the right way and to do it justice and to honor it, and rather than throwing it out there as like just to pull the rug out from under them or to be whatever. Like sometimes you can see this where people had this complaint about Game of Thrones. Again, intentionally taking an example that I think most of you are familiar with, where that they didn't properly set up some characters being killed, and it clearly was just time to get rid of them. There's like 4 or 5 of those characters in the last 3 seasons of the show where they just started like Littlefinger and where they started paring down the character list because they just didn't have time to tie them all up. And so they just started dispatching them in very kind of contrived ways or arbitrary ways. and these are characters that had been like Sir Selmy, like they had, you know, he'd been set up as like a great warrior, and then suddenly he gets killed in a random battle. But it's just because they were done with that character. They just needed to move on. So I think knowing that the fans would have like a really heavy emotional reaction to that, it doesn't stop me from doing it. I'll go where the story has to go, but it does make me take it seriously. It does make me make sure that that character's death is the right death, and so that you come away saying, yeah, that was you know, that was earned. It was done right. Liz asks, as a high school art teacher, I get questions every year about the merits of drug use in the creative process. Obviously, I don't encourage students to do drugs, but with the importance of the sauce and John dies at the end, I was wondering what your personal perspective is on the matter. I've never done any drugs at all. I've never drank alcohol. I've never smoked weed. I've never done anything. There's no joke coming here. I just haven't. Was raised in a very religious family. I have a very addictive personality. I have a lot of alcoholics in my family tree. A lot of reasons to, when I was a teenager and all of my friends started like sneaking beers to sleepovers and stuff and experimenting with it, I wanted no part of it. Every experience I had up to that point in my life with other people drinking and alcohol and drug use had been tragic. I had only negative experiences, and I wanted no part of it. College, same thing. You know, I was away from home, away from where my parents would, you know, from where my religious mother would even know. If I had started drinking, all my friends were drinking, everyone had weed. I had no interest in it. I've never even been curious about it, and I have never ever felt like it would make me more creative. Now, there are many creative people that say that certain drugs help them, particularly mushrooms and hallucinogens. LSD say that it just clears their mind in a way that lets them see connections between things that they didn't before. It just kind of, because your brain is kind of constrained by all the stress and the everyday stuff. And so taking something that kind of detaches you from the world for a bit, it doesn't give you ideas. No one's claiming that LSD or the mushrooms can give you, where you can take LSD and suddenly the idea for Harry Potter pops into your head. But that it just basically lets your own brain kind of freeze it to make associations that it wouldn't have otherwise. I have heard just as many other creative people say that they didn't start doing their good work until they got clean. I can't moralize about it one way or the other. I think it's probably different from person to person. For example, you know, the type of humor I write and the type of plots that I write, I don't feel like I'm coming off as a very stilted and inhibited person. And I kind of am in my everyday life. I'm not a partier, but when I sit down to write, I don't have an issue, or I don't feel like I have an issue with breaking convention or writing things that would not be considered polite or that would be shocking to someone I know. Like, I don't feel inhibited that way. I don't. The thing that people do drugs to free themselves, where they free those inhibitions and kind of let them be their true selves and loosen up. But I'm in the process of writing, I don't have an issue of like freeing my mind. I can easily see that other people may, and that they may have trouble getting themselves into that mindset unless they've smoked something or done something to kind of just let them, if nothing else, maybe to just kind of settle their nerves a little bit, or maybe they get just the stress of the day from their day job. They have trouble like turning that off and writing, and maybe they feel like if they've had a couple of drinks or if they smoked some reefer, that it just lets them calm down enough to write. Because remember, when you talk about drugs, you're talking about a whole wide different range. You know, like Stephen King did all of his writing on cocaine, but he never claimed the coke made him creative. It let him stay awake, because he was writing. You know, he would write 60 hours in a row. He would write for days. Well, the coke he was just using to keep himself going. And the same thing, I don't doubt there's creative people out there. I don't doubt there's very successful CEOs out there. They're doing coke or meth or something like that that's some sort of hard stimulant, not to free their creative mind, but just to keep going. Just the same reason that other people down tons of caffeine, only it's like caffeine is not enough. I need a pill I can take or something I can smoke that can keep me awake for the next 50 hours so I can get this project finished. And again, they've done some amazing work. When Prince, the musician, died, I think they believed he had been up for like 150 hours in a row. He wasn't drinking Red Bull to do that. And this is just something I heard. If any members of Prince's family or associates are watching this, please do not sue me. I'm just using him as an example. There are probably successful people out there that use chemical means to keep themselves going. In my experience, I've consumed a whole lot of caffeine. I've consumed a whole lot of other legal stimulants that are stronger than caffeine. My experience is there's no such thing as free energy, that you will crash eventually and your body will get it all back. And so you can have a really productive day and a half and then you're just trash for the next 3 days because your rhythm is off. You know, your stomach is messed up because you've got all the stuff in your system that, you know, on an empty stomach or whatever, just not sleeping. Yeah, but I would absolutely like to dispel any myth about that you have to, you know, I mean, I made a joke earlier about authors like tend to drink themselves to death. You know, there's a stereotype of alcoholic authors because there's so many famous examples like Hemingway and so many others. But I would not absolutely, and I would tell your students this, I would not come away from that or anyone else with the impression that the drug made them creative or that the alcohol made them creative. I think it's more a case where these people have a lot of spare time and are in an environment around people who will not judge them for being high or being drunk in the middle of the day. And so the opportunity to do that stuff is just there. But there are many, many, many more examples of people that have been creative and productive and done great work that have been completely clean, start to finish. Chris asks, given the parallels between This Book is Full of Spiders plot of both legitimate danger and human overreaction causing entirely different dangers, does the world's or our country's problems in particular, like reaction to the pandemic, alter how you see us as a people? Are there any surprises? No, not really, because it's, you know, the theme of that book, for those of you who haven't read it, is that, you know, humans have a natural limit, according to science, of how many other human beings they can relate to before we just stop seeing them as human beings. So you've got like your circle of friends of, if you're lucky, and your family, and then the people you work with, but there's some point where it just becomes a crowd. So if you're working at a shop with 10 people, you know all those people. But if you're working on a factory floor with 600 people in 3 different shifts, then at some point all those other people are just, it's just a mass of other people. You don't know their names, right? Because your brain can only store so many relationships. And so the core of that was about how that kind of puts a theoretical cap on society's progress, because there's all sorts of tribalism and paranoia and stereotyping that comes with the brain trying to cope with a system that requires millions of people to function, but you can only conceptualize, you know, like 150 of them at best, just due to your brain being a finite thing. And so I think with like the pandemic, and if you're watching this video many years in the future and you don't know what I'm talking about, there's a big controversy with trying to get people in some parts of the country to comply with the safety measures that they put out there, like demanding people wear masks, demanding they stay home, demanding they not go to gatherings, indoor gatherings with lots of other people because of the risk of making them sick. And that a lot of people just refuse to do that, because ultimately, if you tell them, hey, if you walk out in public, you may be fine, but you could be a carrier of the virus and you could spread it to someone else, and then they could spread it to their elderly grandfather. Because that person, that their elderly grandfather is not someone you know, and they're not going to die in front of you, it's hard to conceptualize that as danger as opposed to if the danger was to yourself. So certain people just can't, if they just see it as the government being a jerk and telling them, not to do this, and they can't really grasp that if you go out, it's not just you that you're risking a bunch of strangers, but because they're strangers, it's hard to wrap your head around that. That's not just a problem with getting people to comply with pandemic rules. That's the challenge of human civilization writ large. Like that's, trying to motivate a culture to be cohesive in how they approach problems, and without just creating some external enemy that we're all going to unite against. And trying to get people to overcome tribalism and things like that, when tribalism is built into the brain. Racism and sexism or any kind of hatred of outgroups, that's built into how the brain processes the world. It's hard to overcome that. So there's nothing that's going to happen in the headlines that's going to surprise me, because ultimately it all kind of relates back to that same thing. If anything, it's kind of impressive how quickly we did get billions of people, billions with a B, to start wearing masks and start, granted, like in China, they just said, if you don't wear a mask, we're going to shoot your family. But, we, for the most part, the information did get out there. We did flatten the curve, in social media, as much as as ugly as like Twitter and Facebook and all the misinformation stuff like that can be, has been a miracle in other ways. The information about how to behave and like how to wash your hands and all that stuff, that spread very quickly. If you think about how difficult it would have been to get word out 100 years ago or just 30 years ago, when you just had people depending on newspapers and the evening news and all that, it was actually, the response was kind of impressive. So if anything, I'm sometimes more optimistic than the average person. Ari says, as a fellow Southern Illinois University alum, I noticed a lot of parallels in the settings for Undisclosed in the John Diane books to the Carbondale area, which is where the university is located. Is the city based on Southern Illinois? Yeah, it's not based on any specific locations. It's a city that's roughly that size in that same region, obviously. Carbondale is not a rundown crap hole of a town, or at least it wasn't when I was there. So it's sort of a bigger and much worse version of that. But it clearly takes place in the Midwest, in an area that's rural but not desolate. It's a place big enough to have a shopping mall, big enough, as Carbondale does, big enough to have movie theaters, a lot of restaurants. So there's a lot of, from a writing point of view, it gives you a lot of locations you can write in, whereas it was a very small town. And you'll notice they did the same thing with Stranger Things, on Netflix, a show that is obviously very, very similar to what I'm doing here. But it takes place in what seems like a small town, but when they need to go to a shopping mall, they've got a shopping mall. When they need to go to a carnival, they've got a big carnival. So it's big enough to have stuff to give you multiple locations. It's like, oh, we'll go to the town coal mine or to the pool. Like it's big enough to have settings where you can have scenes take place. Where if it was a truly small town, there's like one stoplight and 4 buildings, you're going to run out of locations. It's like, oh, let's go back to the cornfield. And so it was supposed to be small enough that it didn't feel like a city, because these are not city people, but big enough so that there's stuff. There's buildings, there's warehouses, there's factories, there's stuff where you can have a monster chase you through. Harry says, you've always been pretty vague about the appearances of John, Dave, and Amy. Do you have detailed ideas of them in your head of what they look like? I think so. This is actually a really interesting thing among authors, because a lot of them, they seem to bitterly disagree about how much you should describe characters, about their physical appearance. I mean, you're obviously describing them very well in terms of their personality. In what they say and what they do should draw a very sharp picture of who they are and how they approach the world internally. But in terms of describing what they look like, you'll notice most stories just pick a couple of defining characteristics, like eye color or hair color or something like that. It's rare that if you ever are stopping to describe every inch of a character, it should be for a story reason. And so, for example, in the first Zoey book, Futuristic Violence in Fancy Suits, when she meets Will, she describes him in these very scary terms of like the tone of his skin and the set of his jaw, and that he looks like she sees him as robotic, and the way his suit fits. It like fits too well. There's no wrinkles in it. She sees him as like that's not done to help you picture him. That's done to help you understand the effect his appearance had on her. Do you see? Where other characters, it's much more loosely described, but it's always coming back to what she notices. So when she meets the other woman on the team, Echo Ling, you know, Echo is, from Zoe's point of view, a much, much more attractive woman. So when she meets her, she's like describing her whole body, but not in the way that a horny dude would describe it, but she's kind of seen it in contrast with herself, in the way that she's like very self-critical about how she looks. So Echo's appearance and the way she dresses is very striking to her, for a character reason. I'm not just describing it so that you can draw your own fan art of her. It's described because in that moment, this is what's registering with her, and what's registering is that this is a very striking woman, and she's intimidated by her and kind of dislikes her a little bit, because in that situation, she feels like these people are kind of lording themselves over her, and she sees that as one way that they've done that. So, and then other authors say that they prefer to leave the descriptions even more minimal because they want the reader to fill it in themselves. That you may describe like a look on their face, or that say that the guy has sad eyes or something like that, and then let the reader decide for themselves what they look like. And then you'll see people talk about, you know, how disappointed they are when they watch a movie and a character doesn't look like the way they pictured them. But it's like, how are they going to find an actor that looks like the imaginary person you made in your brain? I don't have any expertise otherwise in terms of how to describe them or how not to. I do feel like to answer the question, I do feel like I can close my eyes and see a pretty detailed version of their faces and their build and all of that. But otherwise, I've tried as time goes on to always have the description serve the story, and especially if you're playing with perspective, I think it's a big thing in terms of how someone sees themselves. It can also be so that, you know, if they're describing their own appearance, it's not so the reader can picture them, but it's more so you can understand how they see themselves. And like Zoe is very critical of her own appearance, but you get the sense that she's not, as she talks about herself, like she's, you know, extremely overweight and ugly, but you don't see other people treat her necessarily that way. You get the sense that she may be more attractive than what she thinks, but I think that's, you know, that's something that's part of the point of the story, is that she's been, the way she compares herself to her mother, to the other women she encounters, it kind of defines, you see where her self-esteem is at that point in her life, and the way she's been made to feel and the way society has made her feel about herself. Final question. Wes asks, how do you feel about Futuristic Violence in Fancy Suits being a technically better written novel/series? Part of the charm of the John Diaz books is the zany comedic events strung through a random spaghetti plot. So pacing of the story is very different from more typical novels. So I know that I'm not going to pick on the wording Suits being a better written novel series. I know that's not what he meant, because he just said that he kind of liked the other one also, or maybe even better. It's more conventional in its format by design. It's not better or worse. It's just a more, because you can have a very conventional setup for a plot that is still just utter insanity in the actual events that happen. And I have tried to make that novel burst with just as much personality and wackiness and everything else as the John and Dave books. But it was an intentional choice to give it a little bit of a more cleaner and conventional structure. It's, I don't want to say it's easier to write, because there are some elements of it that are harder. The plotting is easier when it's a conventional structure. With the John and Dave books, the whole difficulty is that it has to come off in the moment like a totally random series of events where everything happens out of left field, where the thing you think is going to happen, something totally different and bizarre happens. But that the story still winds up in the right place and it still adheres to theme throughout. It is the appearance of chaos that still serves a point. And it's, I had mentioned, I didn't invent that. There's plenty of things that you could, I think, I hate to use Rick and Morty as an example, because I know that like that fandom has a bad reputation, and that like Rick and Morty fans are stereotyped. It's almost like, well, it's like that episode of the Joe Rogan podcast. It's like that. But that's a show that I'm bringing up because I know for a fact a lot of you have watched it, that is very similar in tone. They didn't steal it from me because I didn't invent it either. But it's the same thing where it's a cartoon, and because it's a cartoon, it's super fast paced, and because it's about like dimension hopping and dimension travel and stuff like that, it's just stuff comes out of left field in every episode. They're in another dimension or another universe, and it's just craziness. And there's technology that Rick just pulls out of his suit that they never established was a thing, but they still, no matter how zany the plots are and how out of left field and how they try to make it so every episode is just totally goes off the rails, it still does adhere back to these few central points of kind of a positive nihilism about the family, and about like Rick having to balance being some sort of a decent human being despite having all of these powers, and it and about like how do you behave in a world where your actions kind of don't matter because there's infinite universes, but then finding meaning in your actions mattering despite that. And they keep coming back to that theme, even though it's full of, there's a joke every 5 seconds, even though there's a gruesome death every minute, it still adheres to this primary like ethos of the show, that it's, and this mindset and these themes that it comes back and it hits again and again, because again, that helps the show hold together as a cohesive whole. And I do not doubt for 1 second that it helps them plot it, because it's in terms of, well, what's the consequences of what they did when they traveled to this planet? It's got to get back to this thing of Rick would prefer to just leave his mistakes behind and just travel to another universe and just trash the other universe, and travel to a new dimension and just forget about it. And instead there's this ongoing thing of his past mistakes coming back to haunt him, and him having to deal with it. And then roping other people into his mistakes and so on. And now that that's the theme of the show, you can go back and watch every Rick and Morty episode and you'll see them come back and hit that again and again. That is not a surprise. Me and the creators of that show are the same age. We read the same websites and watched the same shows when we were young. We have the same sensibilities. The same sense of humor, and me and hundreds of other writers of the same age are from the same part of the world. Dan Harmon, I think, is from Wisconsin, I think. I'm from Illinois. But if there's a certain sensibility being from a certain part of the world and a certain type of humor that if you were on the internet in the early 90s, you kind of adopted, where it's very smart and dumb at the same time. I'm sure we both got some of that from South Park. If you were writing comedy in the 90s, as I was, you were influenced by South Park, even though, again, I know it's fandom, the show itself, whatever, probably the creators have probably been canceled by now. I'm just saying that the reason some of these other things have the same tone as what I do is because we all came from the same comedy writing school, which is this very, you know, South Park also has gruesome violence and slapstick violence and people's heads getting exploded as a punchline. But also each episode tries to have a point, tries to come back to the point. So it's these three layers of, you know, violence, very crude base humor, and some sort of very smart idea that it is wrapped around. So again, I can't take credit for inventing it. I just try to do it as well as I can. That is the end of the questions on this list, at least the ones that I managed to print out. So I'll do another video at some point about the Suits series. I'll do another one that I guess is just the other miscellaneous questions I got about writing or about the essays and that kind of thing. Again, the next book in the Zoey series is called Zoey Punches the Future in the Dick. It is the second book. You do not have to have read the first one. If you don't feel like reading the first one, Zoey Punches the Future in the Dick is up for pre-order now. Authors like me depend on pre-orders a lot because the more pre-orders that come in, the more bookstores, if they still exist in October, will be encouraged to stock it and to stock it in a prominent place. It informs the publisher, everyone else, about what the demand is like for the book and for the series. If you have read the first one and if you want to see more and want me to be able to keep writing them, it would help to pre-order. Otherwise, I'll be back with the next video whenever I get time to actually shoot it and then go through the lengthy editing process, which is extremely difficult, adding all of the special effects, as you can imagine. It takes hours. You wouldn't think editing video would be difficult because there are like 8-year-olds who have TikTok accounts with 27 million followers that have advanced editing techniques. But I was not raised in that era. So editing video and doing anything related to video is strange and frightening to me. So I don't do it very often. And when I do it, it takes me a really long time because things that are easy for most people are hard for me. Thanks for watching or listening. I will see you next time.